We've seen how to create collections with the functions available in the standard library. Now let's look at how to operate on them a little bit. And here I have a couple of structures which I created beforehand. So I have a data class album with title, year, UK chart entry, US chart entry, and then I have a track which is the title and the duration in seconds. And then I have a list of probably one of the best groups of all time, which is Pink Floyd. Notice that I only went to about when Roger Waters left. After that, I don't call it Pink Floyd. And so I'm going to start to play with this a little bit, okay? And I want to kind of like show you some of the functions that are available. So let's start with something very simple. Let's say that I want to find all of the albums that were #1, for instance, in the UK. Okay, so let me just minimize this over here. So I know that I have a list of albums over here, and I know that I have a property chart UK, which is an integer. So I just got to look for everything that's #1 in chart UK. Now, a non-functional, so to speak, way of doing this would be to say, okay, for album in albums, then if album chart UK equals 1, then print line, and we're going to do, for instance, album and title, okay? So basically you run that and it should show you, okay, wish you were here, the final cut, and atom heart mother I found as chart UK. Now, this is great, but it kind of does feel a little bit what you always see in the for loop, etc. And we've been talking about functional and higher order functions and all of that. Can we make use of some of this? And what does the standard library actually provide us here? The first thing that we can do is we got a list of albums. So we've got a collection of items. Okay, so I'm going to just like delete this code here, right here. Now I'm going to say albums. And if I invoke completion, I can see that I have a for each. Okay. And the for each, if we take a look, actually the only thing that it's doing is looping through the collection and returning. It's looping through the collection and it's executing the action. So basically what our for loop before was doing. Why don't we do it inside this code? Now this is taking a lambda expression, and albums is a collection. So it's passing in a single value, which is album. And I can do, it's passing in a single parameter, which is album. So I can do album chart UK. Okay, so I have access to this element, which is the album. So I can say if album chart UK equals 1, then print line found it, and then the album title. Now, if we run this, it should produce the exact same output as before. There we go. Now, if you remember, we mentioned that if lambda takes a single parameter, we can simplify it. We don't need to be explicit with the actual parameter name. And in fact, the IDE provides us with a quick fix to do that. So I can just say if chart UK, but instead of the album, on the album, I just do it on it. Okay, so I'm referring to the parameter as it. So there we go. So that's one step. But let's try and improve on this, because we're still kind of doing a for loop, and let's see what else the standard library provides for us. So if we take a look at albums again and complete, we see that we have another function called filter. And what filter does is, let's navigate to it, and it says returns a list containing only the elements that are matching the given predicate. So I have to pass in a predicate, which is a function that takes a type T and returns a Boolean. So it's basically going to do a check. What is the check that I'm looking for? Well, it chart UK equals 1. Now this is going to actually return a result, right? So what I want to do is return this into a list of albums. So we'll call this albums 1. And now what I can do is go on this albums 1 and then again do a for each and then print line found it. Okay? And again, I can have access to it title. But I don't need to be explicit with this variable declaration, right? I can in fact concatenate this. So let's go ahead and make this variable inline. Okay, so I've made this variable inline. And what I need to do is chain it to the call of the for each. So you see what I've done is albums, I then filter, I then do a for each, and I print it out. And again, if we run this, we will get the same result. And this is kind of, you know, the method pipelining or function pipelining, okay? And you can kind of format it to kind of be on the same line, and then as you add more things here, do something there. So, you know, there's other functions I could do, for example, get first. Now, if I do first, then for each is no longer applicable because it is returning to me a single element as opposed to a collection of elements. But point there is that you can kind of like add different functions, point. Now don't go overboard here because it does kind of get confusing. And if you have multiple functions just, you know, pipeline one after another, it's always recommendable to kind of maybe refactor that into another function that groups 2 or 3 of those, as opposed to just having them concatenated one after another, because people start to kind of like lose sense of what is going on. Remember that one of the aspects of functional programming is to make code clearer. If we start to add so many functions one after another, we're not contributing to that. So going back to this code, let's remove that first there and get our code compiling again. Now, instead of me printing out, what I want to do is maybe do something a little bit more sophisticated. I don't want to return the list of albums. What I want to do is return the actual title of the album that I can then later print out or do something with. Now, I could do this in this for each, and let's just break that up into multiple lines. And then I could do something like, you know, val titles. And here we can do a mutable list of, and we'll call it a mutable list of string, right? And then each time I find a title, what I could basically do is add that to titles. So I could do titles, add, and then it title. But you know, this is not the nicest way to do this. And in fact, there's actually a function for this. What I could do is use the function map. And what map does, it allows me to map a collection with certain values into another collection with some other values, applying what's called a mapping function. So if we take a look at map over here, we see that it says, returns a list containing the results of applying the given transformation function to each element in the original collection. So I have collections, and then I have a transform function, and it applies that to each element. So now let's make this titles. And if we do titles, which is also a collection, for each, print line it, we should see that the result of this, again, is just the list of titles. So there we go. Now we have the list of titles for each element. Now, of course, I don't need to do a single value. I can even like do a map. If you take a look at an album, each album has, you know, title, year, chart US, tracks. What if I just want the title, but I also want the year? I could create a pair that is title and then year. Okay, and if I print this out now, we can see that it provides me wish you were here 1975. Now the reason that this is printing it out nicely like that is because remember we have the data if I here which allows me to then get that nice toString format. Now, we're not going to stop at map here. We're going to take it one step further. Okay? Let's imagine that I want to create a function that's going to give me back album and tracks that are lower than a given number of seconds, for instance. So let's say album and track lower than X seconds. Okay? And we're going to pass in a duration. And we're going to pass in a list of albums. So that would be a list of album. Now, how would I go around to implement this? Well, what I want to do is return albums, the ones that are being passed in. And we're going to use this function called Flatmap. And I'll explain to you what this means in a minute. Now, I need, for each one, I need the title. So I have got to store the title in a variable. And now I've got to go through each one and filter out those that the duration in seconds is less or equal than the duration in seconds being passed in. Okay. Once I have that, I want to map the result to a pair, which is the album and the title. Okay. Now this is giving me red because I've said that the function isn't returning a value, so let's just go ahead and correct that. So I need to return a pair of string, a list of pair of string, which is the actual title and the album title. So let's call that the album title, and this is the title of the song. So what have I introduced here? What is the new construct here? It's Flatmap. And Flatmap, basically what it does is, where we saw what map did. Map, you have a collection of items, so you have A, B, and C, and you give it a function. And what it does, it goes and applies that function to each element. So it will do a FA, and then a FB, and so on and so forth, and then give you the result. That's a map. A flat map, what it does is you have potentially a collection of collections. So I have an AB, and then I have a CD. And what it does, I then take that function and I apply it, and it flattens it as it indicates. So it would provide me an FA, an FB, an FC, an FD. And this is exactly what I want in this case, right? I want to get an album and track lower than X seconds, right? So if we look here, for example, we have a bunch of tracks, and these are the seconds in duration. So let's say, let's find everything that is lower than 200, okay? So if we run this code with, let's say, albums and seconds lower than 200, and we'll give the list of albums. And then on this is returning a list, so we can actually do a for each print line. And let's go and print out the album name. Now, notice because I'm returning a pair, I just have to refer to it as first, second. Obviously, I could do some deconstruction of values there, but I'm just printing it out. So we'll just use first for here. And if we run this, we see that we get dark side of the moon, dark side of the moon, dark side of the moon. Why? Because, well, that was the only album that had tracks lower than 200. And each time I've asked it to add the actual album name. Now then I could kind of like do more operations on that to eliminate any duplicate entries, etc.